Okay, let's talk about King Solomon. You hear that name, and right away, you think of the golden age of ancient Israel. This was the king legendary for his wisdom, his unbelievable wealth, and of course, for building that magnificent first temple in Jerusalem. His story is just iconic. But here's the thing, if you actually read his story all the way to the end, in the book of First Kings, it takes this absolutely shocking turn. The final chapter of his life is one of just egregious apostasy and idolatry. For anyone reading it for the first time, it's a jaw-dropping twist. You're just left asking, how on earth did the wisest man in the world fall so far? So this ending, it feels like it comes out of nowhere, right? And it sparked a ton of debate. Did some later editor who wasn't a big fan of Solomon just tack on this negative ending? Or did he just have some kind of sudden collapse in his old age? Well, probably not. I mean, a fall like this is almost never sudden. It's usually a slow, gradual descent. So the question is, how do we actually see this slow-motion train wreck happening? Well, a scholar named Paul Evans has this really fascinating idea. He suggests that the narrator of Solomon's story was incredibly clever, planting subtle clues to the tragic ending right from the very beginning. It's kind of like watching the movie The Sixth Sense for the second time, you know? Once you know that huge twist at the end, all those earlier scenes suddenly take on a totally new meaning. All the clues just seem so obvious. Evans is arguing that the exact same thing is true for Solomon. Once you know how his story ends, you can go back and see all the warning signs you completely missed the first time. Okay, so that's exactly what we're going to do now. We're going to go back and re-examine some of the most famous moments from Solomon's reign. But this time, we're going to be looking for those little hidden cracks, those moments of ambiguity that kind of hint at the disaster that's coming. And as we do this, let's keep one question front and center. Since his downfall was really a series of 1,000 tiny compromises, not one big event, we have to ask ourselves, at what point did he finally cross the line? Let's start at the very beginning. His first big act as king, marrying the daughter of the pharaoh of Egypt. Now, on one hand, this looks like a genius political move. I mean, pharaohs almost never married their daughters off to foreign kings, so this was a huge honor. But on the other hand, this is Egypt we're talking about, the historic oppressor of Israel. The Bible is constantly warning against trusting in foreign alliances instead of trusting in God. So was this a brilliant diplomatic achievement, or was it his very first fatal compromise? Now, what about Solomon's most iconic moment? You know the story, the judgment between the two women and the baby. We all see it as this incredible display of his wisdom. But if we look at it through the Sixth Sense lens, some scholars point to what he doesn't do. He never actually addresses the root problem of prostitution, which is a violation of God's law. He just kind of turns a blind eye. And that feels like a chilling foreshadowing of his own downfall, which was driven by sins of sex and power. All right, so this brings us to the next phase of his reign, where God gives him the very things he didn't ask for: immense wealth and incredible power. Now, these were good gifts, right? They were blessings from God. But we're about to see how even God's best gifts can turn into the heaviest burdens. Okay, so the story tells us that at this point, the people were happy, they were safe, they were living the good life. But then you fast forward to right after Solomon dies, and the people are complaining to his son about the harsh labor and the heavy yoke that Solomon put on them. So which one is it? Was the kingdom this amazing, well-run utopia, or was it an oppressive state built on forced labor? The story leaves it ambiguous, and you're left wondering, when did things go bad? And then we have his crowning achievement, the temple. A magnificent house for God, just dripping with gold. But was it really for God's glory or for his own? And there's this one little detail in the text that is just, wow. It took him 7 years to build God's house. But guess how long it took him to build his own palace? 13 years. That subtle detail, it really speaks volumes about where his priorities might have been shifting. Okay, so up to this point, we've been in the gray area, right? All hints and ambiguity. Well, that's all about to change. We're now moving from these questionable choices to clear, undeniable violations of a specific law for Israelite kings. The ambiguity ends right here. See, way back in the book of Deuteronomy, there's this specific law of the king, a set of rules for any future king. And there are 3 big don'ts. A king must not accumulate huge numbers of horses, especially from Egypt. He must not pile up vast amounts of gold and silver, and he must not take many wives because, and this is key, they will lead his heart astray. So just remember those 3: horses, gold, and wives. So let's start with gold. The Bible says Solomon's annual income was 666 talents of gold. And just trust me, that is an insane amount of money. He wasn't just wealthy, he was actively hoarding it in direct violation of that command. All right, next up, horses. The law was super clear. Don't pile up a bunch of horses, and whatever you do, don't get them from Egypt. And what does Solomon do? He gets 12,000 horses and builds entire chariot cities to house them. And yeah, many were imported directly from Egypt. In the ancient world, horses were military hardware. This wasn't just a fun hobby. It was a fundamental shift in trust, away from God's protection and toward his own military might. And that brings us to the final and honestly the most devastating violation. The law warned against taking many wives. Well, Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. That's 1,000 women. And just as the law predicted, the text states it plainly, his wives led him astray and turned his heart to other gods. The descent is now complete. So, okay, we've just walked through this ancient tragedy. But what does it have to do with us today? Well, pretty much everything. Solomon's story is a timeless warning about just how subtle idolatry can be, and it's incredibly relevant for our lives. See, Solomon's fall didn't happen overnight. It wasn't like one day he just decided to bow down to a stone statue. No, it was this slow surrender to what you could call the unholy trinity that is still so tempting for us today: money, power, and sex. He took good gifts from God and slowly, subtly made them into his ultimate things. And that, of course, throws the question right back at us. Where is that line for us? When does a career, a good thing, become an idol of power? When does our financial security become an idol of money? When does a relationship become an idol that takes God's place in our heart? That line is so subtle. And if the wisest man who ever lived could miss it, you better believe we can too. It's pretty fascinating, actually. Even Jesus brings up Solomon as a teaching example. In the Sermon on the Mount, he points to Solomon's legendary splendor, his wealth, his amazing clothes, and then he says that God dresses a simple flower with even more glory. It's a powerful lesson, right? A call to trust God's provision over our own desperate chase for wealth. And this all leads to the final and most powerful point of all. Jesus once reminded the people that a foreign queen traveled to the ends of the earth just to hear Solomon's wisdom. And then he dropped this bombshell of a line. And now, one greater than Solomon is here. In the end, the tragic story of the wisest king's fall is meant to point us to a better, truer king, one whose wisdom never fails and whose kingdom will never, ever fade.